the Rajeev RCF webinar, and today's topic is design a problem-solving toolkit. So how this will work, or how I've sort of laid it out, is that I'll introduce myself really quickly, some of my work, and then talk about what people think design is, a lot of people, and then what I think design is, and why it is a problem-solving toolkit, and hopefully take you through a few examples that lay that out more clearly. So let's start. So Shikri's already introduced me a bit, but so this is just that again. I think the two more important things here is that I have an undergraduate degree in communication design and a master's in industrial design. So a lot of my work and my understanding of design comes from these two backgrounds. One's a lot about 2D design, it's illustration and graphic design and all of that. One's very three-dimensional, it's about building things and so on. And then I teach engineers at a university in Lahore. So that sort of puts me in a position where I get to collaborate with people from outside my core field a lot. And that sort of feeds into my work and understanding of design. So a lot of people might look at design, or me talking about design as a problem-solving toolkit, and be as confused as this guy. Hopefully, most people here aren't, but a lot of the times, people, at least in Pakistan, that I meet are, when we talk about design, as anything other than what they think it is, which is a beautification tool. So a lot of the common understanding of design in Pakistan, and I think to some extent in India, is that the job of designers is to make things look pretty. So we have this toolkit, which could be a makeup kit from their perspective, and we use that to make things look pretty. So people will make the whole thing and then say, oh, now design this. And by that, they just mean make this look nice. And I think that is firstly, a very, very reductive way of thinking about design, but also probably the easiest part of design. Because I think making things look nice is very, very easy compared to making things work and solving problems using the same tools, which is mostly my focus in design. These are some sort of thumbnails of a few projects that I've worked on. So I do a lot of different kinds of work. Some of it is very sort of top left. You can see it's kind of a calligraphic piece. To its right is a portrait of Darwin that I made with pen, so it's very classical illustration. But I also work a lot with technology, and then and some architecture. Hello, Reena, are you saying something?
No, nothing. No. You go. It was nothing.
Okay. So yeah, this is a sort of a wide variety of work, but what I would sort of say about this is that even I can admit that some of these projects are quite cosmetic. So while I was talking about sort of beautification as being the understanding of design, being a misconception, that is still something we as designers do. And I can probably say that 6 of these 8 projects had the visual or the beautification part as one of the parameters. But these 2 projects that you can now see highlighted, which both sort of are shown as apps, are the projects that are probably the closest to my heart, and I may be the most proud of as well. And they are very, very problem focused. And the visual of them, or the way they look, it was probably the last parameter that we used. And I'll be talking about one of these in a little more detail, which is the service that we built or actually redesigned for the Punjab government, the Pakistani side of Punjab, their government's immunization service. And I was brought in as the design lead on the project. And the purpose, or we were given quite a few guidelines at the start, but also a lot of freedom to figure out how we can improve the design of the existing service. And sorry, so this is the sort of the leaflet that they were using, the government was using before we were brought on. And these are 2 sides of the same piece of paper. And when any immunization team went to a child's house to give the child their shots, or the child was brought to a care center, the immunizers would give their parents this card on which they would fill out the kid's name, basic information, and also when each of the shots was administered. And they would also write down when the next shot would be. So the parent was supposed to bring their kid to the healthcare center or schedule their next appointment accordingly. But this had a lot of problems. And I've kind of listed down 4 of the main problems that we were told about. One was that a lot of parents would lose or damage this card, and that obviously was a big problem, because if that had the dates of the next shots written on it and you lost it, that could seriously affect the kid's health. There was also lack of information about what each of the terms BCG or PV meant. So it lists down all these injections and their English abbreviations, but it doesn't really say what they are. And the information that there is also isn't very helpful for a lot of our users here in Pakistan, because a lot of these parents are illiterate or semi-literate, and then so the whole card doesn't really give them much information that they need to take better care of their kid. There was also lack of accountability on the immunization team's side, where they could kind of fake the number of shots that were given to the kid, because often the parents weren't very educated. And sometimes they would also they would keep the cards and just fill them out themselves without administering the shots. So that was a huge problem as well. So the problem that we came into this project, and we sort of framed the problem as this: how might we empower illiterate parents in Punjab to ensure better immunization outcomes for their children? So our whole focus became on how we could empower these parents who may be illiterate and semi-literate in some cases to take better care of their kids using our system. And sort of this kind of also ties in the accountability part and giving the parents the power which earlier was with the immunization teams, who would often shortchange the parents by not doing their job properly. So a lot of this project was about field research. So we had to go to a lot of people, our audience's houses, and not just interview them about their expectations, but try to understand what they knew about immunization, how they cared for their kid, if they understood what each of the injections was, also what they, for instance, thought what a healthy 2-month-old kid looked like. And there was a lot of questions, and the process itself, the process of building our solution, was done with our users. So a lot of these sessions that we had in our users' houses were co-design sessions. So we were doing the whole design process with them, and they're basically our co-designers rather than me as an outsider going in and telling them what to do. So we created this booklet to replace that yellow card that I showed you earlier. And this is the first page of the booklet. So on the right, you can see all the injection names of the injections with some details of what they were. So BCG, OPV, hepatitis, and penta, and so on. But if the parent can't read or understand the information that's written in Urdu next to it, they can match the color to the organ to understand what each injection is for. So if the immunizer doesn't give their kid the yellow injection, the parent would know that the kid's lungs could be affected. And similarly, green for their brain and also for their lungs, which is penta. So this gave the parents, whether they were literate or not, the power to understand what each injection was and why it was so important. So they could hold the immunization teams more accountable, but also be more make more of an effort to make sure that everything was done properly. So it was about giving them more power in this, and actually the visuals of this were also figured out in their co-design processes. So we were working with them to build this, to even draw this outline of the kid's anatomy. And this was according to what they thought lungs looked like or liver looked like. And so we weren't even looking for anatomical accuracy. We were looking for what they understood as these organs. And we worked with that. Within this app, we also had, so another problem that we found was that kids especially parents in rural areas in Pakistan, often don't know exactly how old their kids are. So the difference between 6 or 8 weeks or 10 weeks, they wouldn't often always be sure. So we work with a team of doctors to basically create these illustrations for what, for instance, a 6-month-old kid does. So even if the parent doesn't know whether their kid is 6 months old yet, if they can see the kid doing all the things that are listed on the page, the kid's probably around 6 months old, so they can be brought in for those shots. And this is for another page from that booklet. So this shows when the kid's 9 months old, and so you can see the kid. It's written in Urdu, but you can see the image of the kid being able to sit down straight or rattling something and looking at it, so they can make a connection between auditory and visual perception, and also try to learn more by playing with it. And they can crawl with their chest up. So these are 3 indicators for what a healthy 9-month-old baby looks like in our context in Punjab, and that might indicate that the kid's shots are due. And on the page on the left, you can see that it says measles on the top, and that's a purple injection. And it sort of says that if you don't take this, if the kid doesn't get this injection, they might have a skin problem. And on the bottom of that page, you also have the same diagram you had on the first page, in which you can see all of those indicators. So each page has whatever injections are due for that visit, and it also has details of what that injection is for. So even if the user couldn't read any of this, they should be able to understand why this was being done and what everything meant. We also built an app which the immunization team was given, and they had to, so this kind of was about their accountability. So they had to fill in all the data that they were filling into the booklets into their apps as well. And we had a central portal where everything was updated, so we could keep track of immunization sort of outlay all over Punjab. And one of the things we added to this was, you can see on the image on the left, that the immunizer who goes to these houses and sees so they need to mark their attendance by scanning the QR, chip inside the booklet that the parents had. So the immunizer were basically marking their attendance at their houses. So they had to go. And then on the right, you can see that they had to fill out which injections they're given. And because the parent now understood what each injections was for and how important it was, they could hold the immunizer accountable if they didn't fill out all 3 of the injections that were due. So this kind of became like a way of holding our immunization teams accountable. And while my part of the project was only one section of this whole drive that had been going on for a few years with the Punjab government, we received some great feedback and also results in our testing. And this was an article that Dawn News did about the whole technology-driven vaccination program. And yeah, the title is "How Pakistan Turned Around Its Vaccination Program Using Technology." And I would like to say that they could have added using technology and design, but I'm also biased that way. So if you guys want to turn off, to unmute your mics, if anyone has a question at this point, I would be happy to take that. Does anyone have any questions for now? I'm assuming not. Okay, I can. Rina, I just saw your mic.
Can we the question answer thing in the end?
Sure, okay.
Okay.
So if anyone's still wondering, or actually, hopefully if anyone was more confused about this earlier, they'll be slightly less confused and more curious about how else we can use design. And so let's take that forward from here. So this is a question that what is design is a question that literally from the first day of design school you're asked, and there's no correct answer to this in my opinion. So I have my own understanding or explanation for what design is, but I don't really mind other people's explanations either. But I think what's more important to understand and agree over is what good design is. So while you may have your own definition of design, I feel like having some sort of an agreement on what good design is more important. And here I believe that while a lot of people have this notion that design is completely subjective, I actually think that design is very objective. So you can set out parameters for whether something is successful or not, something is good or not. And if the design doesn't meet those parameters, it really shouldn't be called good design. So whether you might not like the slide, the color of something I make, that's subjective. But if the purpose of it is met by the audience that's using it, I would say that it's still good design. So I think this is a more important part of it, and I break it down into three things. The first being the problem. So to be able to judge any design, you need to know what the problem was that the design was trying to solve. Second is the intention of the designer, or at least the intention behind the problem, and then the outcome itself. A lot of the times, people only focus on the outcome. So they'll see, for instance, a chair and say, oh, this is badly designed because it's uncomfortable, or oh, this is badly designed because I don't like the color. But until they know the problem that chair was made for, judging it as good or bad design, I think is flawed. For instance, you could take a bar stool from a bar and compare that to an office chair and say that clearly the office chair is better designed because it's more comfortable. But unless you know that the bar stool, the purpose of the bar stool is actually that people sit on it for a little while and then they're not comfortable enough to keep sitting there. So they feel the need to move. And it meets that really, really well. So that bar stool in its own environment is very well designed. But if you put an office chair in bars or in place of a bar chair, while the office chair may be really comfortable, it's actually terrible design for that bar. So the point being that it's just judging a design on the outcome is basically not even half the parameters you should be considering. So starting with the problem, then the intention, and then coming to what the outcome is, and combining them to figure out whether something's good or bad design. I'm assuming everyone's heard this term before, minimalism, in some way. Minimalistic, minimalism. Have become quite common terms in our language now. But even if somebody hasn't, it's basically very, very quickly, even though it comes from a whole art and design movement, it's often sort of seen as the philosophy of only using or displaying the minimum possible or the least possible parts. So you don't, nothing being embellished. There's no extra parts to any design that you would sort of fit that into the category of being minimal. But so this guy was a design director of Brown for about 40 years and is considered one of the most important industrial designers in history. And he has been one of the biggest inspirations behind the relatively recent trend, or at least like the last few decades, of minimalism in electronics and generally in product design. And his name is Dieter Rams, and a lot of my fellow industrial designers, as well as myself, sort of worship him as sort of our guru. But he's, on a serious note, he's been very, very influential, not just to me and a lot of other industrial designers, but a lot of tech companies and a lot of product design companies over the last 50 or so years. And he has this quote, which I think is one of the tenets of design to live by for any designer. And that is, good design is as little design as possible. And this goes, again, against some of the stuff that people think in our part of the world think about design, about embellishment and the makeup example that I gave. But his philosophy is to only design the thing that's needed and not have any extra parts, any extra color, anything else other than what's exactly needed to solve a problem. And this is a room that he designed in his own house about 50 or actually more years ago, around 60 years ago. And while I won't go into details, but you can kind of see that everything seems very utilitarian. It's very, it's sort of, you don't really see much extra stuff in that whole space. The But then these are some of his products from his time at Brown. And I love doing this little exercise. If a few people want to unmute their mics and do a quick guessing game, that'll be nice. So if anyone wants to sort of guess what year these products were made in, that'll be that could be fun.
90s, if I'm not wrong.
Okay, 90s. Does anyone else have any guesses? Okay, I don't think anyone else has unmuted their mic, so I'll go on. So a lot of I've shown these images in my presentations a lot, and I get answers everywhere from 1960 to 2010, and mostly towards like 1990 or 2000s and around that time. And these are the correct dates of when these products were made. So the food mixer or food processor on the top left is 61 years old. The shaver underneath that is 56 years old. And similarly, around 50 years old, the coffee maker and that hair dryer. And the reason I love these examples is that one of the tenets that Dieter Rams talks about is that good design is not fashionable. And the reason I really like that is that a lot of the times we think of design as being the most fashionable and the most currently attractive thing. So we'll even be asked, what's in these days, which basically means what's fashionable these days, and let's design according to that. And his tenet that design shouldn't be fashionable is that if good design remains good design, whichever era you might be in. So if these products were well designed in 1957, they're still well designed in 2018. So you can't really put a timer on it. Whereas if something was, for instance, designed in 1962, which was following the fashion of the time, it might have been really flowery or either very space agey. So it was a couple of different aesthetics going on at the time. So if you saw something from the 60s which was very designed according to that fashion, you would immediately know that that's 50 years old. So firstly, that's very dated. Secondly, oftentimes something like that won't be used 50 years from then because it obviously seems old. And we have very fashionable products from even 5 or 6 years ago, which were fashionable at that point, which now look old because they were fashionable back then and they're now not fashionable now. So if the designers had just worked on making the best possible product without caring about what was in fashion, they would have been as timeless as these and some of the other examples of good design that we'll cover. So I think that's a very good sort of tenet to live by as a designer, where you're not looking for current trends or you're not looking for what's fashionable at the moment, but just trying to make the best design possible. And that in turn automatically looks nicer as well. These are some other products that Dieter Rams did in his early days at Brown. And while a lot of you might not have seen any of these products or even recognize them in any way, you might recognize these a lot more. So each of these products from Brown is at least 50 years old, actually at least 45 years old, the rest are older. And all of them very directly inspired at least one Apple product. And one of the big reasons for this is that Steve Jobs looked up to Dieter Rams as his design sort of inspiration. And so does Jonathan Ive, who's the VP of design at Apple, so as well as Mark Newson, who's I think the VP of industrial engineering now. So Apple's whole design aesthetic, which also follows very clear notions of minimal design or as little design as possible, are very, very directly inspired by Dieter Rams and his work at Brown. And it's not just that they're copying from them, they actually pay very direct homage to him. So when the calculator, Apple calculator you see at the bottom right, when that was released, they actually officially put out a press release saying that this was to pay homage to Dieter Rams's Brown calculator because they'd used his design principles throughout their design product design work, and they still do. So we've talked about good design being as little design as possible. We've also seen design as a possible problem-solving toolkit. So very quickly, we'll go through a few examples of using this very little design to solve very big problems. And does anyone want to unmute? Because this would be, it'll be nice for this section to be slightly interactive.
Yeah, I think everybody's unmuted. Yeah, everybody's unmuted.
I don't see any, like, apart from you. Okay, can everyone say hi? So I can
Hi.
hear you.
Hi.
I can only hear you and Shivi and Reena. Okay, I can see. I can hear more people now. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear more people. Good. Okay, so we'll go forward. So we'll now see really big problems that somebody solved very long ago using very little design, or as little design as possible. So back when insurance was first brought in the United Kingdom back around 250 years ago, a lot of people who owned cargo ships would put in extra cargo on their ships so that if the cargo made it to the other side, they would basically win a lottery because there was a lot of stuff on it. But if the cargo ship sank, they would get paid by the insurance company anyway. And if this thing was so frequent and so many people died on these ships that these ships became known as coffin ships. Cargo ships kept getting drowned in the oceans. So how would you solve this problem today? How would we solve this with technology today? If ships were being sunk and we had to do something about them because they were being overloaded.
Change the design of the ship, maybe, so that it can bear the load but still not sink.
Okay, so redesign the ship so that it can take on more load. Okay, that could be one. So a lot of the times, again, I don't think a lot of people have muted. If anyone else has any guesses or suggestions, they can say them. Okay, so I don't hear anyone else, but a lot of the times when we talk about this, I talk about this with my engineering students, and they have very high-tech solutions to this. You can have different kinds of weighing options. You can have GPS trackers, and you can have satellite trackers, and so on. To a lot of technological solutions to ensuring that the ship doesn't get overloaded and then doesn't sink. But 250 or 200 or so years ago, the solution that somebody came up with was this circle with a line through it. And how this works is that this is basically drawn on the hull of the ship. And that circle and line in the middle is still the same today as it was 2 centuries ago. And every cargo ship in the world still has that line with the circle. And the point is that when you're loading the ship, if you can still see the line in the circle, that means the ship can still bear some load. If as soon as that line hits the water level, that means you can't put any more load on it. And a solution as simple as that solved the problem of overloading ships, because people who were loading those ships were also supposed to go on them in their journey. So they would obviously not overload the ship and have a risk of sinking and dying in it. So that circle with a line through it was, I love that solution because it's a perfect example of as little design as possible to solve a really big problem, like a problem which was killing hundreds of people every month, and was solved with that drawing, which continues to this day. And this is the guy, his name is Samuel Plimsoll, and this is a statue of him in Liverpool, in England, to this day. Public urination is another problem that we have in Pakistan, India, and it was a big problem in Dhaka as well. And this is one of my favorite examples of great sort of creative thinking. And so in Dhaka, the government announced that they were going to look for solutions to stop people from basically urinating on the street. And there were a lot of solutions given, some very high tech, some somewhat low tech, but all of them involved a lot of public money being spent. So a local cleric or imam from a local mosque actually came up with a winning solution. And the solution was, so these walls already say that urinating on these walls is prohibited. And that's the same in Pakistan, and I think some places in India. So this imam from the local mosque basically just said that you should write the same thing in Arabic. And while some of you might not know this, so I'll just explain a little. A lot of people in Pakistan and Bangladesh, and I guess in India, most Muslims grow up reading the Quran, which is in Arabic. but we don't really understand it because we don't speak Arabic. But we also grow up and as a population tend to respect wherever Arabic is written because people assume that it's something holy. So this local imam basically said, if you write the same thing in Arabic on the wall, people will start respecting those walls automatically. And that was their solution. So they used just the same amount of paint and wrote the same thing just in Arabic. And suddenly people started thinking that they had to respect the public walls. And I love the solution because it's so simple and and the local imam came up with it because he understood the psyche of the people better than any fancy designers or engineers they could have hired.
Try this in India also, I think so.
Okay, that's fantastic. It's such a brilliant solution. So
Really?
I'll now really go through really quickly because I don't notice there's a lot of time, not much time left. This was done in slums in Brazil, but then in Indonesia and some places around the world as well, where the houses in the slums weren't getting enough light. So the solution was to get plastic bottles from a nearby dump, put some salt water in them, and put them in, fix them into the tin roofs. What that did was it refracted light in to these dark interiors, illuminating them from within, and it sort of works like a 25-watt bulb when you're inside that inside the little house. So this enabled people living inside to have light all day, where they wouldn't earlier. And again, this required no extra money, no fancy equipment, just the local dump, plastic bottles from the local dump, and some salt water. So I think I'll skip some of these examples because they require more explanation, but I can give you these sources later if anyone wants to read up on them.
Sure, that would be very interesting.
This I'll really quickly just mention. So this was in Ladakh in India, which is a mountain town. And how many people recognize this guy? I'm guessing everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So and this movie, of course, Three Idiots, which I also love and is very, very popular, is based on this guy. So Amir Khan plays a character based on this fantastic gentleman, and he came up with a solution for Ladakh and also a lot of brilliant engineering students. Solutions, which I would love for you guys to read up on later. And this is called the Ice Stupa. And if you look this up, Ladakh's Ice Stupas, there's a little short documentary by Al Jazeera on them as well. And it's, I think, one of the most brilliant engineering design solutions that I've seen in many years. So something as simple as, for instance, this is more examples. Something as simple as a door handle, which in our normal lives we don't really think much about, and everyone's used them. But these sort of door handles actually recently got banned in Montreal in Canada because it was learned that there had been cases of people dying in their rooms because people with diseases like arthritis or people going through heart attacks couldn't open them because they couldn't grip them. So now every building that's made in Montreal, Canada, has to have these lever-like handles. And this is just an example of something that a lot of us wouldn't even think about as a design problem. But it is when you really get into designing for people who aren't like us and people who may have problems that are different from us. And this, I think, is a good example of what designers should be doing. These are very common. You'll see these doors all over the world. It says push on both doors, and there's also handles. And if you but I think all of us have in our lives also tried pulling such doors or something, pushing pull doors and hitting ourselves in them, and also seen other people do it and laugh at them. But the thing to do here would be actually to remove both handles from this door. And the only thing you could then do is push. And you could probably don't even need to write push on the door then. And you would get rid of these 4 things and make the design better because there's no way anyone will try pulling a door without any handles. So that would be a good example of removing some of the elements from this and making it a better design. And on the other side, you just have
handles are there
these
for 1 minute, Ali. Maybe these handles are there for people like us, for some people to help them climb up help them climb into the train. Hold it and climb up into the train. Help them climbing into the train or bus.
Oh no, but these are in an office. So these are and there's been and these are very common around the world in a lot of buildings. So this is a very common example of useless things being added onto a thing to make it worse design and waste money as well. So yeah, we've seen a lot of examples, and then this is a question that often comes to me, and also is a very common thing to sort of think of that's talked about, is how can you become a better designer? How can you become a designer? And a lot of people seem to have the image that designers are somehow like inherently creative, or they have to be you have to be born with the ability to design. And I really don't believe it. Like, whereas there might be some people might be at an advantage because they're naturally good at something, but there's nothing stopping anyone from becoming a designer, and a very good designer, if they just did a few things well and practice them a lot. So my really quick way of summing those up is, firstly, you need to become very good at noticing things. So if you just go around noticing how everything around you works, or more importantly, how everything around you doesn't work. So the next time something doesn't work that you're trying to use, instead of blaming yourself for not being able to figure it out, blame the designer that made it so that you didn't understand it. So just noticing a lot is a very good start. Second one is, anyone who knows an obsessive designer would probably know that designers love complaining about things. And I actually think that's a very good thing to do as a designer. When you notice things in an environment that don't work, it's very good to point them out. Complaining, I just wanted to use that word, but it's more about pointing them out and talking about them, and also complaining to yourself about that thing not working. And then using your head to figure out why it doesn't work, and also how you would make it work, or how you would improve that design of the thing that you were complaining about. So going from noticing to complaining, maybe, to then figuring out how it could be better. In the last part, have a sketchbook or a notebook and a pencil or a pen. It doesn't need to be fancy. And when you think about how to improve those things, write them down or sketch them if you can, which is always better. So these are the 4 things I think people need to become a good designer. Pay attention, identify problems, think about those problems, and sketch out what you think you can do to solve those problems. And if we all did these things and paid attention to them, practiced them, while we couldn't probably become Dieter Rams, we may be able to become, say, 20% of him. If anyone's really confused still, hello? Yeah. If anyone's really confused about this still, we can chat later. But I hope that some of that confusion, if anyone had that earlier, is by now gone, and I can now take questions.
Your voice is going, Ali.
I have a question. Hello, Ali, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so like technology is changing every now and then, and we have some certain criterias based on that. I mean, we realize that okay, now iPhone 4 is phasing out, 5 is coming, 6 is coming, right? So we are every time coming up with some new feature functionality. How do you guys, as a designer, evaluate? Okay, this design is not gonna work out. What is the criteria? Based on that, you guys decide. Okay, we have to come up with now better version of it. So how do you evaluate, this is out trend, in trend?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think a lot of I think one of the biggest misconceptions about design that people have is that, or even designers have, is that designers are supposed to tell people what things should be and how they should work. So a lot of good design or design that works is design that's been tested with a lot of people. So when I, for instance, was working on that booklet or that app, I often did 20 sketches for each icon that would go inside in that book. And then I had to test those 20 icons with our users and have them decide which was the best one. So our users basically fed into my decision. So I gave them options, but they were the ones deciding the solution. And while that can't always happen in your project, there are a lot of user experience design techniques which involve research about how to sort of guide how to test your product. So I've worked on some industrial sort of products as well, and even then we conduct user testing to validate our design. So we'll do a really quick low fidelity prototype of something, or like 10 versions, and test those 10 versions out with a few users, figure out what's working, what's not working, then make the next version and test that out, and eventually get into a design which kind of works for our users. So one of the things, actually, it's a very, I think, relevant that you mentioned iPhone. One of the things that a lot of people complain about with Apple's products is that they don't change their design every year. And while I understand that people want to get a new design when they spend that much money, one of the reasons that they don't change that design is that they don't need to. Like, and frankly, Samsung or LG or whoever also doesn't need to, because if a design works really well 1 year, it will likely work for the next 3 years as well. But companies are forced to sort of redesign things just because they need to sort of feed into the marketing of that product. So if you left it to the designers themselves, it's very likely that most of these tech companies wouldn't be changing the design for a long time. So for instance, see something like a MacBook Pro, which was the basic design of it hasn't really changed for a long time. And a lot of other laptops have adapted a lot of things from that design. It's not necessarily that they've copied it, but they realize that it's something, if a laptop's design hasn't really changed for 5 or 10 years and it works for people, it probably is good design. So a lot of these things, the design changes that we see are basically led by marketing rather than good design decisions. Does that sort of answer your question?
Can I also say something?
Yes, thank you, Ali.
Hello?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I also think that you get familiar, when the user gets familiar with the design, he does not like, at least some users, at least like a person like me, I wouldn't like changes in designs every year because I'm getting familiar with something. I wouldn't want it to change immediately next year. I would prefer the design to remain the same.
Right. I think that's a very important point as well. Yeah, sure.
Okay, Ali, my last question. Sorry if I'm taking out of time. We have a few minutes. My last question is, we always, as a buyer, new functionality and technology always attracts us to, always go to change the, iPad, iPhone, or MacBook, laptop, and whatnot. How much do you think the contribution of design into it, which motivates buyer to go buy and change the product they're using, and how it drives sales to the company?
Yeah. So again, I will start this by saying that I'm obviously biased, but I do think the design plays a very, very vital role, and not just because of how something looks, but as I talked about when we talked about design sort of problem solving, but a really, really big part of design, especially now, or the designer's job in these tech companies, is user experience. So, for instance, every designer at Google is actually called a user experience designer, and then they have subcategories within. Apple has, I don't know, hundreds of user experience designers, and they're trying to figure out not just how the product looks, but how the user uses it, and how they can make that usage better. So, if, for instance, your product works really well for you, and as I think, as for instance, Rina said, that if you get used to that product, you also don't want it to change. So if, for instance, you've been using a certain platform or certain company's product for 5 years and it works really well for you, there's a big chance that the designers designed it really well for an audience that you're a part of. And then once you really like it, you're much more likely to buy it again. On the other hand, you could they have an example of a really well-named product where one part, for instance, the hardware is done really well and the software is done really badly. And most people, after like maybe trying it because the hardware looks nice, won't buy it again because it doesn't work for them. So it's also very, especially in electronics now, it's very, very important for both hardware and software to work just as well, and also look nice. So the look might get you to buy it for the first time, but you probably won't be buying it again if the user experience wasn't up to your expectations.
Okay, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me? Okay, so I have a comment. So in the chat, I've shared a link. So this was if you look at it, it's called The Power of Design. It's a podcast shared to me by some of my sort of top designer friends. One of them heads user experience design at Deloitte Digital in India, and he highly recommended it. So I suggest everyone listen to it, and you also if you haven't.
No, I haven't. I'll definitely check it out.
Check it out. It's great. Second, how do you think one can go about validating hardware design, not just UX design, but hardware design cost effectively without wasting a lot of time? Because there are these features, let us say there are these technology features that would still take time to develop, but you still have to test them out with users.
Right.
What sort of proxies can one
So-
take? What is the process as a general, without accounting for a specific use case? How can one go about it?
Right. Yeah, so I think so since obviously my master's training was in industrial design, we did a lot of that, and a lot of the times I completely understand your thoughts that that's the problem you're referring to, because it's very hard to prototype hardware, especially technological hardware, to a stage where it can be tested effectively. So so how we were trained to do it was to break it down into as many parts as possible, and also make a lot of physical prototypes for the form of the thing. So you can, for instance, if you had say something like I don't know, maybe like I don't know, an electric scooter, you make the actually that's probably simpler. So if you have a car, that's obviously very complicated. You probably can't build the whole car and then test it out, right? So then you can break it down into smaller bits, and which is why with something like a car, there are teams that do different parts and they test them out independently. So you might have 6 different steerings that you just make 4 models of. So you're testing out the physical part. So that testing would just test what the physical form should look like. And then somebody else might be doing testing for the buttons on that steering, which wouldn't be part of the 4 models of the physical testing. And those buttons could just literally be a panel with all those buttons drawn on, and you could be testing whether users can use the volume control on the buttons on the steering without looking. And so you'll have to break it down into a lot of parts, and most of the testing would actually happen in analog. So you would probably have you wouldn't be expected to have digitized any of this. So for instance, on the phone model, if you had these buttons literally just drawn on, so while the users for instance using that steering, you can and they're looking straight, and you can ask the user to, for instance, decrease the volume, and then you'll see if the user is looking at the steering or if they can press that button that you've drawn on without seeing, and then if they can, you sort of had validated the position of your button, even though the button really doesn't do anything. So it's very important to kind of understand that there's no expectation of the technology working, but you can work around it. And the parallel of this is, for instance, the app that some of the apps that we tested, we didn't get into even the development of them till we tested everything out. So when we were testing the initial icons out, all of it was drawn. So we had little drawings which we would say, okay, if this was the menu, where would you click? And if they clicked on one of the, and this was on paper. So if they touched something on the paper, we would give them another piece of paper saying, oh, this is now the screen that appears. So think of sort of a physical version of that, where none of it is technologically kind of connected or has any sort of development at the back, but it's sort of a fake form version that with drawings that you're kind of working with. So that it's very hard, but that's sort of how one can do it.
Okay, thanks for the overview. I think we can also reach out to you personally for some of these specific problems that we would be facing.
For sure. And even if you have any more questions about the presentation or examples, then I also I'll just go to the last slide. That has my website and email address, and also if you want, sometimes I post my work to Instagram as well. So if you want to, if anyone wants to sort of see that and has any questions about any of the work, I'll be happy to answer those as well. Do we have any more questions right now?
Right, sounds good. Anyone has any question for Ali? All right, I think that's.
I have one question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I have one question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Ali. So help me out with this. So we're trying to onboard a user experience designer for Nimble. and we are really having a hard time figuring out what to look in the how to judge a person's work by his or her portfolio. For a visual designer, it becomes pretty much easier. You look at the portfolio, you get a look and feel that it looks good, etc. How do you do that for an experienced designer?
Oh, so that's actually a very good question and very common problem as well. So one of the things that I've seen done in, for instance, places like big tech companies do as well is, so are you talking about, by the way, are you talking about getting people in for interviews or finding them online?
So before we interviewing them, then I know what questions to sort of ask them. But before we spend that time interviewing them, how do we screen them initially?
Sure. One of the great things that I've also done, and most tech companies would do, is even if you find somebody whose portfolio is only visual, so they might have, say, screens of apps or screens or renders of the products that they've built or pictures of them, and no user experience process. That's perfectly fine, because most people have a very hard time putting that process online. Even I don't really have much process because it's pretty hard to make it look nice. But the really good thing is to literally just call them, get them on a call, and ask them about the process that they follow, and do a little analysis of their design of their portfolio earlier, and ask them try to figure out specific details about how they got to something. So, for instance, somebody has like some product, even like maybe a tripod that somebody has designed and has built. Asking them exactly how they figured out how tall the legs should be for the specific user that they've designed it for can give you a very good understanding of how much is actually thought about this and whether they've tested this, and if they tested this, what questions they ask. So a lot of the times, I think it comes down to them, you asking them specific questions and seeing how much detail they went into to validate their assumptions, which I understand is very hard to do just on the portfolio, because I think you at least need to get them on a call to figure that out.
Okay. Before getting on a call, are there few pointers you would suggest one should look out for when just going through their portfolio?
Yeah, I think
before spending that time on a call. Yeah. Sure.
I think one of the things that I would say, if I had a lot of portfolios and they looked nice, the visuals were fine, one of the things that I would then look for is if this person has told the story of their process well. So, for instance, while they might not be able to go into specific details, if they've built a product and they've included their sketches and their prototypes and some pictures of them testing those out, that's obviously a good indicator that they've gone through some process. And sometimes, even if they've not written that, even if they're not shown that, if they've written it well. So a big part of user testing and being a good user experience designer is the process of kind of getting to that final product. So even if the final product isn't perfect, if they've described some of it, that'll be a very nice start. Because most people, if they've gone through the pain of doing user research and testing and all of that, will at least put some of it out there, whether it's in the form of an essay or a case study or some pictures. I think that could be an initial filter, and then getting them on a call and specific questions would be the next.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Right. Thank you, Ali. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the very informative session. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining in.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ali. It was very informative and very well put.
Thank you.
The slides were great, very simplistic. I think just pictures, but you going through them. I really appreciate the slides.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think if I was talking about design and as little design as possible, and then I had very busy slides, that would be very hypocritical.
And the slides were there till you finish reading them. That's more important.
Right.
Like the audience could read them. They were there for a long time, so we could read it. That is a good thing.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you guys for being here, and let me know if anyone has any questions later on, and that's my email where you can get to me as well. And you guys have my phone number on WhatsApp anyway.
Yeah, following you on IG right away.